Gun trucks were never part of any official blueprint. They weren't standard issue, they weren't supplied by command, and no engineer sat in an office designing them. These machines were born out of necessity, created by soldiers in the field when ambushes became a daily reality, and convoys were left exposed on the deadly roads of Vietnam. One event in 1967 would mark a turning point, but before we get there, we need to understand how the situation had spiraled to that point. By the late 1960s, American forces were scattered across remote outposts, and the only lifeline connecting them was the supply convoys. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every meal, spare part, or drop of clean water had to be hauled by truck through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. The roads themselves were nightmares, narrow dirt tracks winding through mountains and thick jungle, sharp bends, blind corners, steep drop-offs. Names like Devil's Hairpin and Death Valley weren't just dramatic nicknames, they were warnings. Dense foliage pressed right up against the roadside, giving the enemy endless places to hide, to strike, and then vanish without a trace. Convoys had little in the way of defense. Maybe a couple of jeeps fitted with M60 rode along, but that was hardly enough. Tanks and armored carriers were too valuable at the front lines, so supply columns were mostly left on their own. And remember, these weren't hardened combat troops. They were drivers, mechanics, clerks. Their mission was delivery, not direct combat. But in Vietnam, there was no front line. Every mile of road was a battlefield. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong knew this well. They studied the routes, picked the weak spots, and timed their ambushes with deadly precision. Mines, rockets, automatic fire. It could take less than 5 minutes to cripple an entire convoy. Something had to change. That change began in September 1967. On the afternoon of September 2nd, a 39-vehicle convoy from the 8th Transportation Group departed Pleiku, heading toward the coastal city of Quy Nhon. They had just finished supplying the 1st Cavalry Division earlier that day. The return trip should have been routine, but trouble started when a 5,000-gallon fuel tanker at the rear began slowing down. Soon, the column stretched out, leaving a 500-meter gap between the lead and trailing vehicles, vulnerable, exposed. To make matters worse, there were only 2 escort jeeps with mounted M60s, far too few to cover both sections of the split convoy. The commander knew the danger, and just as that realization set in, it happened. A 57mm rocket slammed into the lead jeep. The air erupted with fire. From the tree line, automatic rifles, RPGs, recoilless rifles, and mines tore into the column. In seconds, nearly 29 trucks were trapped inside a kill zone that stretched almost 700 meters. Out in the open, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The convoy lay exposed like prey on an open plain. The single biggest hazard was the tanker at the back. 5,000 gallons of fuel, a rolling fuse. When it took a direct hit and burst into flame, it didn't blow into a fireball by sheer luck. What followed was chaos. Trucks stalled and crumpled in minutes. Recoilless rifles punched through metal, hidden mines detonated on cue, and disabled vehicles began to pile up like wreckage on a battlefield. Men tried to fight back, but their weapons were paltry against a coordinated ambush. Most drivers carried nothing heavier than rifles and pistols. The only real firepower came from a pair of escort jeeps. Spread out and outgunned, the convoy had almost no way to reply effectively. A company from the 1st Cavalry, stationed less than a mile away, rushed to help and arrived roughly 15 minutes after the attack began. By then, the attackers had melted back into the jungle, leaving death and wreckage behind. The toll was stark: 9 Americans dead, 17 wounded, and nearly 30 trucks abandoned or wrecked. The message was mercilessly clear. The enemy had learned how to strike convoys swiftly, inflict maximum damage, and vanish before relief could arrive. If nothing changed, those supply runs would keep turning into slaughter. After the Pleiku ambush, the transport soldiers stopped expecting timely rescue. They quit relying on doctrine and began improvising survival. The first simplest fixes were humble: stacks of sandbags and plywood lining the beds of M35 2.5-ton cargo trucks. It was a crude shield, something to hug when bullets zipped by, but it carried problems. Sandbags soaked through in the monsoon, becoming dead weight that sagged suspensions, slowed braking, and sometimes snapped axles. The trade-off between protection and mobility was brutal, so they moved to harder solutions: steel. Plates were welded where possible, turning open beds into low, boxy fortresses. Steel was scarce, though, so ingenuity and a certain moral flexibility kicked in. Spare metal from depots vanished overnight. Sometimes crews borrowed sheets from other units without asking. Survival trumped paperwork. Out of those nights of frantic welding came the gun box. 4 steel walls welded to the truck bed, high enough to shelter gunners and give them something solid to fire from. Some crews layered plates with small gaps between them, a primitive spaced armor that could reduce the punch of explosives and armor-piercing rounds. Even the engine bay, fuel tank, and cab floors were reinforced where they could, aiming to give drivers at least a fighting chance against mine blasts. Bigger chassis proved more reliable. The heavier 5-ton M54s could carry thicker armor and heavier armament without collapsing under the load. Even dump trucks found a second life as gun platforms. Then a wilder idea took hold, mounting the armored hull of a ruined M113 APC onto a truck bed. Crews stripped the engine and tracks, left the armored shell, and bolted it in place. Suddenly a truck could wear almost the protection of an armored personnel carrier and provide a stable base for machine guns and heavier weapons. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't official, but it worked. These field-built defenses, rough, noisy, and improvised, changed the calculus on the roads. They didn't make convoys invulnerable, but they gave crews a chance to return fire, to hold a position long enough for help to arrive, and to survive another trip down a road that for too long had spelled certain danger. The extra armor came with a price. Loaded down with steel, the trucks grew top-heavy, sluggish, and unstable on sharp curves or uneven terrain. But when the shooting started, that sacrifice was worth every ounce. And the weapons? They kept getting bigger, louder, and deadlier. At first, it was just a few M60 machine guns, usually 1 or 2 on a swivel mount, just enough to throw lead back at the enemy. But soon, crews were bolting on .50 caliber Brownings, sometimes 2, sometimes 3. Then came the heavy hitters. Some trucks mounted the M45 Maxon turret, an anti-aircraft system that carried 4.50 cals capable of spitting out nearly 2,000 rounds per minute. When that beast roared to life in the middle of an ambush, it turned everything in its path into silence. Other crews went even further, experimenting with miniguns. One of the most notorious trucks, nicknamed Pure Hell, carried a hand-cranked M134, an updated throwback to the old Gatling gun of the 19th century. It looked bizarre, almost out of place, but it worked, and it worked well. Ammunition was never in short supply. These trucks hauled thousands of rounds for every weapon they carried, along with grenade launchers, light anti-tank rockets, and crates of fragmentation grenades ready to be tossed from the sides. Many crews also trusted weapons outside the standard issue. Old favorites like the BAR, the Thompson, the M1 Garand even captured AK-47s stripped from enemy fighters. If it could fire reliably, it earned a place on board, and just as the weapons became personal, so did the trucks themselves. Each one bore a name painted in bold letters that carried pride and defiance. The Untouchable, Brutus, the Misfits, Eve of Destruction. These machines weren't factory products. They were hand-built fortresses shaped by the men who depended on them. And those men trusted their creations with their very lives.